them up too. As you will see, to my mind, what brings these things together is that I have this amazing tendency to see belief everywhere. So I'm going to try to convince you that at least some cases here are actually better construed as belief. And that's the overarching theme, because if some of you are also painfully aware is that I've been running around for a couple of years now trying to argue that perceptual experiences are actually beliefs. So that's the common theme here. All right, here's the plan. I'll first talk a little bit about belief. Then I'll take up Alief as a certain kind of challenge to what I'm going to try to argue. And I'll argue that there will be certain sort of dilemma which will point to at least a number of the phenomena that we are concerned with there being better construed as beliefs. And then I'll talk about experience, which shares a certain kind of modularity with the Alief phenomena, which also might make you think that it's just a damn bad idea to think of them as beliefs. And then I will actually say that also creates a certain kind of dilemma, which you can get out of if you adopt my position on experience. So that's the plan. Right, let's talk a little bit about belief. What is belief? Here's a rather uninformative answer. Belief is a propositional attitude. And these guys we have been talking about in philosophy and psychology too for ages now. In philosophy, I'm not completely sure about psychology because I'm not an expert, so I'm very interested to hear. But in philosophy, I think these guys, the propositional attitudes, have a rather austere nature. Terms like belief and desire have come to be these great umbrella terms, which subsume a lot of states we talk about it in commonsensical terms. So really what brings them all together is that they have this attitude and proposition structure, and that's basically all it takes to be a propositional attitude. So to sort of tell them apart, you have to either show that there is a difference in the propositional component, or you have to show that there is a difference in the attitudinal component. And more we just don't have in our toolkit. And that's what I'm going to argue in some cases, that things actually should come under that umbrella which has the beliefs. And which we usually call belief in philosophy, at least. All right, that was that. But of course, when we talk about belief, you want to know what precisely is the attitude component that makes a state into a belief, as opposed to a desire, for instance. And a traditional answer is it's holding true. That answer has come under some pressure by people like David Wellman, who have been arguing that, well, yeah, sure, belief is a holding true, but there are other holdings true. So this is not enough to separate the beliefs, for example, from the imaginations. So you want to know even more precisely what is the attitudinal component in belief. And there you might think that you might get, that's a question where I think that you might think that you get help from functionalism. So functionalism in general would be the idea that you can characterize belief by its functional role. That would have two main components, its input or formation role and its output or dispositional role, action motivating role, something like that. Now, what I think is a good idea to appeal to if you want to distinguish the beliefs from, for instance, the imaginations, is to look to the reason's role, the inferential or reason's role of belief. And in that case there, I think that it's a good idea to say that this role is closely related to folk psychology and its reason's explanations. And then these two components take a certain form. For belief's input or formation role, people tend to very much put a lot of stress on the evidence sensitivity of the state. And in the output role, it would be the reason providing power, and that would be reasons for action, but also reasons for further belief. So you have both theoretical and practical reasoning, where belief gives you reasons to do things in a certain way. And I actually think that that is a rather promising route to take if you want to single out belief from the other, let's say, truth-holding attitudes, holding true attitudes. All right. However, if you do that, so if you use these two components here, evidence sensitivity and reason providing power, it might seem that you run into extension problems. And one extension problem is people say, well, there are beliefs which are evidence immune. And as we will see, these Alief phenomena that we'll be talking about will fall under this kind of thing. And here you might think, okay, if we want to rule that out, we could, if we want to allow this and nevertheless stick to this reasons functional role characterization, we might put the prime on the output role, on the reasons providing role, and not put so much emphasis on whether it's evidence sensitive or not. But if you do that, you sort of hop onto the other horn of a certain kind of thing which might look like a dilemma, because then you might want to say that there are mental states which provide reasons for belief and action in just the way beliefs do, but which are not beliefs, because they sort of have the same kind of reason providing role for especially further belief. And I would say that, well, perceptual experience here is a prime example. And if you have to count in perceptual experience, many people will say, oh, yeah, well, then something has really gone wrong here. So what I want to do is I want to make a case for both of these claims. There are beliefs which are evidence immune, and perceptual experience is a if peculiar kind of belief. All right, let's talk about Alief. Anandi already had some stuff up in her talk, which explains why this fits in so well into this dialectic here. One thing one can say about Alief is that it has been postulated as an action-motivating cognitive state different from belief, that we need precisely to save belief from those examples which seem evidence immune. So here's a quote from Tamar Gendler which brings this out. The strategy is simply to get the offending items out of the extension of belief. So she says, if new evidence won't cause you to change your behavior in response to an apparent stimulus, then your reaction is due to Alief rather than belief. So it's sort of an extension cleaning up job we summon this state to do for us. All right, so tuning people into what the notion is supposed to explain, you always get examples of these horrible states where what you actually have is what Gendler calls a belief, what's the word now? It was there a second ago. Belief discordant Alief. I mean, because they might be in accordance, but the ones that are really interesting are those where they go, where they part company with beliefs surrounding them. So here, this is the skywalk. This horrible contraption that they put above the Grand Canyon with a glass floor. And some people actually manage to walk on that thing. I mean, to me, it's completely inconceivable how anyone can do that. But as you see, there are people there. So here is what Gendler says to sort of give you a feel for what an Alief now is. How should we describe the cognitive state of those who manage to stride to the skywalk's center? Surely they believe that the walkway will hold. No one would willingly step onto a mile-high platform if they had even a scintilla of doubt concerning its stability. But alongside that belief, there is something else going on. Although the venturesome souls wholeheartedly believe that the walkway is completely safe, they also Alief something very different. The Alief has roughly the following content. Really high up, long way down, not a safe place to be, get off. And I mean, as I said, for me, that would certainly be the action guiding state, not the belief. All right. Here's a different example. I call it the poison example. This is based on an old study by, I don't really know how that guy's name is pronounced. Rosen? Okay. By Rosen, where subjects saw sugar poured into 2 bottles and then applied labels of sugar and sodium cyanide, each to one of the bottles, making their own choice. So they know it's sugar in both bottles, but they stick on the labels themselves. So here we have 2 such bottles. This is what you have done. What happens is, if you then ask to pour sugar into your coffee or something, you'll really avoid the one that says sodium cyanide. Quite amazing. Okay, Gendler's commentary on this: while Rosen's subjects believed that both bottles contained sugar, consideration of the second rendered occurrent an Alief state with the content cyanide dangerous avoid, associated with the second bottle. And this belief discord in Alief played a role in governing their behavior. So that's why they didn't want to pour from that bottle. All right. So now I'll explain a little bit more about what Gendler thinks an Alief is, and I'm just referring to her because it's really her thing. She introduced this. So she says a paradigmatic Alief is a mental state with associatively linked content that is representational, affective, and behavioral. So an Alief really is a 4-place relation of Alief between a subject, a representational content, an affective content, and a behavioral content, as opposed to belief, which is this 2-place relation. Okay. Now, what are we talking about here when we talk about content? It has these 3 associatively linked components. One of them is described as a representation R of some object or concept or situation or circumstance. So there really can be all sorts of things. An affective component and a behavioral component B, the readying of some motor routine. And at least these 3 are only associatively linked according to Gendler. Okay, and these states are activated, consciously or non-consciously, by features of the subject's internal or ambient environment. Aliefs may be either occurrent or dispositional. All right. Here's why they are called Aliefs, because they are associative, automatic, irrational, a state that we share with non-human animals, developmentally and conceptually antecedent to other cognitive states, affect-laden and action-generating. Okay, so, and then you can get these pairs of discordance, where you have a belief discordant Alief, like in the skywalk, really high up, long way down. That's supposed to be a representational component, not a safe place to be. Affective, get off, supposed to be readying some motor routine, certainly in me. Okay, while at the same time you believe that the skywalk is perfectly safe. At least those that actually walk out believe that. I mean, they're giving some strong behavioral evidence of that. And similarly in the poison case. Okay. Crucial differences between such a state and belief are supposed to be these 2. So the representational component, according to Gendler, does not have to be a proposition. And it's pretty unclear what she says about that, but it's clear that it does not have to be a proposition. I think she thinks it can be a proposition, but it doesn't have to be. And while in the case of belief, it certainly would have to be a proposition. And then she argues that an Alief is not an attitude of acceptance. So it's not only not holding true, it's not even an acceptance in any kind of sense. Okay, so why do we need it? I already was into that a little bit at the very start. She says any theory that helps itself to notions like belief, desire, and pretense needs to include a notion like Alief in order to make proper sense of a wide range of otherwise perplexing phenomena. And some of those we have just given examples for. And then she says, in short, I will argue that if you want to take seriously how human minds really work, and you want to save belief as this thing that philosophers have talked about, then you need to make conceptual room for the notion of Alief. So Alief is precisely supposed to save belief as the evidence-sensitive state from the extension problem posed by evidence immunity. And this is the quote I had up before. If new evidence won't cause you to change your behavior in response to an apparent stimulus, then your reaction is due to Alief rather than belief. But it is supposed to do this extension cleaning job without denying Alief's motivating and explanatory power. So you still have a state that sort of shares the output role with belief, but not the input role. That's the very idea here. Okay. And that brings us to the notion of Alief explanation. So what kind of an explanation do you get when you use the Alief to explain, for instance, my never stepping onto the skywalk? And here's again what Gendler says: introducing the notion of Alief into our descriptive repertoire provides a useful alternative way of answering why questions when confronted with a behavior or tendency that we seek to explain. It provides an alternative that falls somewhere in between a classic reason-based explanation of the sort offered by belief-desire accounts and a simple physical cause explanation. So my gloss on this is that Alief explanation is clearly supposed not to be belief-desire explanation, but to be still a kind of intentional explanation, at least in a wide sense of intentional explanation. For one thing, because it explains intentional action, not just mere behavior or mere things that happen to you, and because the explanatory force depends on the Alief's content. And the question I'll have is whether there actually is room here for such a... Yes, exactly. As some here have argued, there is good reason to doubt that there is room in between these two. Okay. So here's what Orsa and I have actually called the Alief dilemma in a paper we published a little while ago. And it goes like this: either this explanation provided by Alief is recognizably intentional, then Alief becomes much too much like irrational belief for being a really different kind of state, or Alief is sufficiently different from irrational belief, but then the Alief explanation is no longer recognizably intentional, not even in a wide sense. And that's what I'm going to explain now, why we think that. Okay, so where does this come from? To have an explanation that depends on a state's content, I think you need a whole proposition. If I just find a piece of paper which says poison in a drawer, that doesn't tell me anything about where, like, danger is or something like that. I need a proposition that gives me a reason for an action. I need to know what it is that is dangerous or poisonous or something. I mean, in the bottle case where you see the sticker on the bottle, somehow the poison is tied to its being the bottle that's poisonous. It's not just poison and then you run away. It's you're not taking sugar from that bottle because somehow there is something that represents that bottle as containing poison, and that's a whole proposition. But in addition to that, I also think that in order to have an action explanation that depends on an explanation that depends on the state's content, you also need an attitude of acceptance to that proposition. If I just entertain a proposition, poison in a bottle or something, or even poison in that bottle, without assigning it any kind of truth value or something, why would I act on that? I'm just thinking of this. So if I want the content to do this work for me, where it actually explains what I'm doing in reaction to it, then I think I need an attitude of acceptance. All right, Gendler has an argument to the effect that Aliefs are not attitudes of acceptance. Now, I don't think that argument works. It draws on a different follow-up experiment, also by Rosen, where what you label the bottles with is sugar and not poison. And actually the effect of avoiding the bottle that has poison on it weakens, but it's still there. So even when it says not poison, you have a reaction like, let's take the sugar from the other bottle, which is quite amazing, I think. And it's extremely interesting. However, I do not think that it shows what Glüer claims it shows. Here's what she claims. Although these subjects were in an Alief state with the content poison, dangerous, avoid, the content they were prompted to imagine was exactly the opposite. They did not, as the acceptance condition requires, regard it as true in some way that cyanide is to be found in the vicinity. Instead, it was the negated presence of the word cyanide that rendered occurrent their cyanide-associated Aliefs. Now, I think the last bit is just right, but I don't see why this shows that the Alief is not an acceptance attitude, because this seems to me to be confusing the content of the inscription on the bottle with the content of the Alief triggered by seeing the bottle. Apparently, bottles that have the word poison on it, and as well as bottles that have the words not poison on them, trigger the same Alief. Yeah, fine. But that does not tell us anything about whether this Alief is an acceptance of its own content or not. So I think this leaves us perfectly free. Actually, it leaves Glüer perfectly free to construe these as acceptance relations, acceptance attitudes. Okay, so these are my claims. You need a whole proposition and an attitude of acceptance. Now, if we go with that, if we construe Alief as a propositional attitude of acceptance, it would have to be really sort of highly modular. I mean, it needs to be isolated in the right way from the influence of the evidence. And it also needs to be isolated from exerting at least too much influence on surrounding beliefs. Because we don't draw all the inferences that we would otherwise draw from this acceptance relation. Nevertheless, we could say that, but even if that is the case, what would have happened now, if we take all this on board, is that belief, discord, and Alief would have become very similar to compartmentalized belief. Okay, how about the other horn of the dilemma? Now, the claim here is not that all belief, discord, and Alief, in fact, are better construed as compartmentalized belief. I don't really know that. That might not be so. There might well be phenomena here where such a construal remains utterly implausible. But the more implausible construing them as compartmentalized beliefs becomes, the less plausible it is to construe the resulting behavior as intentional action in any sense. So the more the less plausible it is to think of this as compartmentalized belief, the more plausible it becomes to think of the explanation as just causal explanation, and not intentional explanation of intentional action. What happens is just something that happens to you, not an intentional action. So here's what I want to argue, the conclusion I want to draw from this with respect to the Alief phenomena. Those states that do have the power to intentionally explain action are better construed as irrationally compartmentalized belief. That might not be all the states that do causal work here or explanatory work here, but those where it's plausible to think of this as an intentional explanation, they actually are so similar to irrational belief that that's better, that they're better construed as that. All right, that was the Alief part. Now for some experiences. Here's the minimal account of a perceptual experience that I'll be working with. I'll say that a perceptual experience is a conscious mental state with representational content and a distinctive phenomenal character. Now, luckily, Maya has already talked a bit about this, so I don't need to go through all this. The one thing that takes quite a stand here is that I say it does have representational content that does not steer you clear of all forms of disjunctivism. That is true, but it does make your position into a position of what has been called intentionalism, simply because there is representational content there. So I'll not argue for this. This is what I'll just take for granted. All right. But as I said, this is fairly minimal. It leaves any number of questions open. And one question is what I call the state question. What kind of mental state is experience? As far as we have seen this so far, it can be, I think it tells us that this is, in a minimal and hopefully uncontentious sense, a propositional attitude, because there is a representational content there. The world is being presented as being a certain way. You need a proposition to do that, and any state that is assigned propositional content in this way, in a basic minimal sense, is a propositional attitude. But above that, it doesn't tell us very much. This is compatible with its being belief, and it's compatible with its not being belief, can be a sui generis propositional attitude, whatever. Okay, so that's a question that I want to answer, and as I told you, my claim is that it is a belief. And then there is the content question, and that would be the question, what form does the content of this propositional attitude take? And there in the vicinity, there are a huge number of questions that are being discussed. One question is the content singular? Is it not? If it's singular, you make it world-involving in the sense that we had up in the previous talk. I'm not going to take a stand on that in this presentation. I'll say something about its form later, but mostly I'll be interested in what I call the state question. So what kind of state is it? If you think of a web of belief here, what I'm using the blue circle for is just delineating the states that are beliefs. And the question then to ask is experience outside of that, or is it sort of the first kind of belief on the inside of that web? Now, one thing that I think nobody should deny, whether you want to have it outside or inside, is that experience is inferentially integrated into our belief system. That can mean all sorts of things. I like to stress well, we'll come to that. But in any case, many people say that. Both philosophers and psychologists can very much agree on this. And then there are people who think that all this inferential processing that is going on throughout the whole system can be modeled in some sense along Bayesian lines. And if you think in those terms, then you will think of all the inferential connections that we have here as basically, in some interesting sense, of the same kind. So this might be probability assignments and updating on the basis of incoming evidence. That's what you would do if it's Bayesian. Okay? If you think that way, then you might get to say things like this. Here we have Chris Frith telling us, perception is a belief about the state of the world. There is no qualitative difference between perceptions and beliefs. A perception is a belief about the world that we hold to have extremely high probability. Now, I'm not completely sure that Chris is actually saying the same thing as I'm saying, and that's something I could use some help on. What I'm fairly sure about, though, is that the argument he is making from the essential nature of the relations that we are talking about to saying all these states that play the role of essentially of standing in these relations, it's the same kind of state in that respect. So if that's what makes something into a belief, then we should count the experiences in, because they do stand in these relations. Now, of course, someone like Chris will call things inference that a philosopher might be hesitant to call an inference. Because here what we, the inferential web sort of includes a lot of what has been called, I don't know whether that's, subpersonal states. And what I'm really interested in is sort of the web of beliefs as it extends to the personal states. Nevertheless, as I said, I think the argument is fairly similar to the one I'm trying to make, namely that inferential integration is what is really, really, really important to being a belief, and we have that for experiences. But, and here's what makes this somewhat similar to the Alief phenomena. In the case of belief, we have these glaring phenomena that have been called modularity phenomena, which seem to outrightly militate against putting the prime on the inferential connections. So, I'll run you through 3 of them. We all are very familiar with the Müller-Lyer and other robust illusions of that kind. Those 2 lines do not look to be the same length. They just don't. We know that. We don't believe they are of the same length. And intuitively, that is very, very bad news for any kind of belief theory of experiences. Because in the known illusion cases, S knows that not P, but nevertheless has an experience, and now I'll call it an experience S of P, S of the lines being of different length. And so, since you naturally would think that the P here in the experience S of P will be the content of the experience, and if that experience is a belief, then I have outrightly contradictory beliefs. Not a good place to be in. Then there is believed illusions. This guy is trying to pick a necktie in a store where the light is very iffy, and he knows that. He knows that the light is iffy, and he thinks that this tie, well, it looks a certain color, but it probably isn't because the light is iffy. So he suspends belief as to the tie's color. Of course, in this case, the case is best set up as there not being an illusion, in the sense of the tie is actually the color it looks, it's green, but nevertheless the guy does not believe that, because he thinks that the light is too iffy. So he explicitly suspends belief regarding P, the tie is green, but nevertheless has an experience S of P, the tie looks green. And again, if we construe the P as the content of the experience that is a candidate for being a belief, then we have an unhappy match. You both suspend belief and believe something by means of experience. And then there are even weirder things. There is the waterfall illusion. If you stare long enough at the waterfall and then direct your gaze at the rocks beside it, the rocks will look as if they were moving up and down at the same time. So here the subject has an experience as of P and not P. And that would then look like a contradiction even within the content of the very same belief. And that is really, really not a place you want to be as a belief theorist. All right. Now, this pushes us in the direction of saying, okay, let's forget about the belief theory. On the other hand, I think it's a fairly strong component of our pre-theoretic or common sense conception of experience that it provides reasons for first-order empirical belief and action, as I was saying before. And then you might claim that a satisfactory account of experience accommodates its role as reason provider in our folk psychological practices of explaining and justifying empirical beliefs. Now, maybe we can't have that at the end of the day, but it's something that is desirable, I think, such an account. So we should try to have it. But then it seems that if we are thinking in terms of folk psychological reasons explanation, there aren't very many sort of distinct slots into which attitudes can go. Basically, it seems to me that both beliefs and experiences play the same role here. Both go into what you might want to call doxastic slots in practical and theoretical reasoning. So you explain your actions by means of the experience, or you explain forming further beliefs on the basis of your experience in just the same way as you use beliefs to do that. So this kind of role won't tell them apart. And now a belief theory has this virtue of just simply being able to accommodate that. A belief theory simply extends the intuitive inferential model of theoretical reasoning, if we are talking about first order empirical belief now, to experiences. So that's something that can push you in the direction of thinking, there is something good about the belief theory. It does this thing. We get this unified model, too, of all the inferential practices that we have here and our explanatory practices, too. So this is neat. But of course, there is the modularity stuff. So now we have these two seemingly incompatible poles. Before I tell you how we can solve that, I'll run you very quickly through something that I very tendentiously call the intuitive conception of reasons, namely the conception of reasons on which I think it is plausible and important to accommodate the reasons providing role of experiences. I mostly do this in order to prevent certain ways of getting out of the dilemma that I don't want to leave open. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about reasons for first order empirical belief. In a certain sense, they rationalize forming that belief, in the sense of they give you something that you can recognize as something that speaks for forming that belief. If it looked green, well, that speaks for forming that belief. And makes it sort of, subjectively speaking, at least rational in a certain sense that you formed this belief. We can understand why you do that. Makes it intelligible in a certain sense. Okay. They do that actually by providing inferential or evidential support. So it's not just that subjectively someone might think that a certain experience or a certain reason speaks for something else. This is a little bit more of an objective matter than just that. There actually needs to be some sort of evidential or inferential support relation, something that other people can recognize. That's why it has this rationalizing power. If I present two propositions to you, one being the reason for why I believe the other, and they have nothing whatsoever to do with each other, then that won't do much to make me seem rational in your eyes. All right. Such reasons are prima facie or defeasible. So a defeater might come along. That is, these inferential or evidential support relations aren't all just like deductive or something. There is material inference going on here that can be defeated. You don't need to run through the inferences in any conscious way. And maybe this is one of the most important things here. They do not require second order states. So you do not need to think that, oh, my having this state provides me with a reason for having this other state. That would just be completely fatal because it would run you off immediately into regresses. So that can't be required. All right. Now, if for those of us who think that we would like to provide for experiences, reason-providing role in this sense in our account of experience, we might be tempted, just in the case before, as in the case before, to go for compartmentalization? Why don't we say that the experiences are somehow compartmentalized? After all, they are a bit modular, right? Aren't they? There is a perceptual module. So why shouldn't we take that way out then? And I think Alex Byrne has actually said things that point in that direction. I don't think that's such a great option, because take a case like the known illusion again. In the case of these robust known illusions, the subject is fully aware, or can be fully aware, both of the experience as of P and the belief that not P. You can bring them consciously together as much as you like. You can reflect on the experience. You can be, whatever you do to not be irrational, you can bring all those measures to bear on your experience, but it just won't budge. Those lines do look as if they were not the same length. There's nothing you can do about it. It's hardwired into your system. And that is actually part of why also I don't think that compartmentalization is such a great way to go, because the subject that is subject to the known illusion is not irrational in any sense, I think. Her senses are fully functional. This is the way they ought to function, or this is the way they are set up to function. And the same for inferential powers. We don't need to postulate in any way that some inferences are not drawn in the right way here, or anything like that. So I don't think that compartmentalization actually is a great way out. And even if it were, there is an argument that might show that we nevertheless would not get the reason-providing role out right by settling for a belief theory of the traditional kind, where the content of the belief of an experience as of P simply is P. We can compartmentalize them fine, but we would still not have the right kind of inferential connections that we want for experiential reasons providing, I think. And here's McDowell. He gives us the stuttering inference argument. Or rather, I give you the stuttering inference argument, which I think can be drawn from what McDowell writes. This is an argument, it has the form of a reductio, so something here must be wrong. Right. So he uses as his premise that experience provides inferential reasons for first-order empirical beliefs. Just what I have tried to tell you is a good idea to go for. Then he observes, as I did too, that these reasons are divisible. But now if you plug in the traditional belief theory, what you get is an inference from an experience as of P to a belief that P. That's clearly a stuttering inference. You go from P to P. And while there is nothing wrong with calling that an inference, if you like, it's certainly not an inference of the form that is divisible. I mean, whatever this comes in with, it will go out with. Right? So we have a contradiction here somewhere. And of course, what McDowell, at this point in his career of thinking about experience, wants us to go for is he wants us to chuck out the inferential reasons providing. So you can take this as a reductio of the first premise. But I don't want to do that. I want to keep the first premise. And I want to, now so I think this then brings out the dilemma that we can sort of summarize here now. And this is again putting it tendentiously. Either we account for experience's reason-providing role by construing it as belief. Then the subject of a known illusion has openly contradictory beliefs and the inferences stutter. Or we account for experience's modularity by not construing it as belief. Then we don't have an account of its reason-providing role. So we'll have to do a lot of work in saying what kind of attitude is this really, and if we want to give an account of the evidentiary power of perceptual experience, we need to come up with something to say here. We can't just use as the belief theory, the belief model of doing this. Okay, now I think this is not a true dilemma, because there is a position that gets you out of it. And that is the position I've been trying to defend for a while. I call it phenomenal intentionalism, not because it's so phenomenal, but because it works with phenomenal contents. So it claims that experience is admittedly peculiar, but kind of belief with a phenomenal or looks content. So here the trick is to deal with the modularity phenomena, not by thinking of experience as another kind of propositional attitude sui generis if you want, but by fiddling with the content. Okay, and here's the basic idea. It's actually fairly simple. An experience S of P does not have the content P, but the content LP. For instance, it looks as if P, or if you have an object there that has looks a certain way, you can say X looks F. So you put in a looks operator into the content, and you construe that roughly along the lines of what people have called phenomenal looking, just to give you a hint of what kind of looking this is. This, of course, then contrasts clearly with what I call standard intentionalism, where the experience is a propositional attitude, but one sui generis, and an experience S of P simply has the content that P. All right, so that's the form of intentionalism that I like, phenomenal contents. And you can see in the known illusion cases S knows that X is not F, but nevertheless believes that X looks F. That's just fine. Same believed illusions, you suspend belief regarding X as being F, but nevertheless believe that it looks F, and it does, it looks F. And in the waterfall illusion, it depends on how you construe the negation, but there is a reading on which this is fine too, as believe that X looks F and looks not F. That isn't a contradiction. Things can do that. All right. And as for stuttering, on phenomenal intentionalism, the relevant inferences do not stutter. You go from LFX to FX. That's perfectly fine. It seems to me it's very close to how we think of these things providing reasons. That's what we say if we are asked. Like, imagine I go and buy a very ugly T-shirt in a store with iffy lighting, and I come out, and you look at it and you say, why on earth did you buy that? And I say, well, it looked my favorite red. That's how we explain actions and beliefs all the time, it seems to me. All right, so that brings me to the conclusion. Just summing up both parts of this talk. Those supposed Aliefs that provide recognizably intentional explanations for action are best construed as irrational and evidence-immune beliefs. And perceptual experiences across the board are best construed as beliefs with phenomenal contents. Thank you.